Now, next, I'd like to welcome Lucien Baumgartner, who will be joining us remotely.
Sorry, here we go. Very good. So today I will present joint work with Pascal Willemsen and Kevin Reuter on the polarity effect of evaluative language. Both Pascal and Kevin are in the audience as well, I think. In this talk, I will present two new studies in experimental philosophy about the polarity effect in regards to thick and thin concepts. So first up, the question is, of course, what are evaluative concepts? And in this study, we mainly focused on two evaluative concept classes, namely thick and thin concepts. So I will start explaining with thick concepts. So thick concepts have both a descriptive and an evaluative content. Let's take the term honest, for instance. So an honest person is someone who tells the truth, isn't deceiving, or is frank. But there is something else that is conveyed whenever we use the term honest. So whenever we characterize a person as honest, we usually evaluate the person or the behavior positively. In other words, we ascribe praise to the person in virtue of the descriptive features, namely being truthful, not deceiving, or frank. Other thick concepts that you might have encountered are friendly, rude, or cruel. Negative thick concepts such as rude and cruel ascribe blame instead of praise. Now, thin concepts, on the other hand, are words we use quite often, such as good. And in contrast to thick concepts, thin concepts do not have descriptive content or only minimally so. So, for example, if I say what Amy did was good, I do not tell you why she deserves praise, just that she does deserve praise. Thus, thin concepts are said to merely evaluate without doing so in virtue of descriptive features. Other thin concepts are concepts like ideal, bad, or awful. Now, one of the big questions in the thick concept literature is whether it is possible to separate the evaluation of a word such as honest from its descriptive content. It's a bit of a tricky question because the evaluation occurs in virtue of the descriptive features. So an honest person is praiseworthy in virtue of being truthful. And this indicates a kind of a very strong relation between the evaluation and the descriptive content. Now, there are two camps that answer the separability questions quite differently. On the one hand, we have the separabilists who argue that the evaluation and the description can be separated. And on the other hand, we have the inseparabilists who claim that they cannot be separated. Now, certain separabilists argue that the evaluation can be separated from the descriptive content because it is only pragmatically implied rather than semantically entailed. So in essence, this means that the evaluation should be cancelable if they were right. To settle the separability question, we can use the so-called cancelability test. So in this test, we simply try to cancel the evaluation that is standardly carried by a thick concept. So on the negative spectrum, this looks as follows. So imagine a speaker, and the speaker says, Amy is rude, but by that, I'm not saying anything negative about her. So here, the speaker simply cancels the negative evaluation of the term rude, and then we can ask participants whether the speaker contradicts themselves or not. On the positive side of the spectrum, we can cancel the positive evaluation, as in Amy is honest, but by that I'm not saying anything positive about her. If the statement sounds contradictory to participants, the evaluation would be semantically entailed, and if the cancelability statement sounds felicitous, it would be pragmatically implied. Now, when using this test, some authors have found a very interesting effect, the so-called polarity effect. The polarity effect points towards a fundamental asymmetry between positive and negative thick concepts. So Willemsen and Reuter found that canceling a negative evaluation is much more contradictory than canceling a positive evaluation. In their study from 2020, they asked participants to rate how contradictory cancelability statements sound for positive and negative thick concept respectively. And the participants had to answer on a 9-point Likert scale, from 1 being not contradictory at all to 9 being highly contradictory. And as you can see in the plot on the right here, the contradiction ratings for negative thick terms are significantly higher than the ones for positive thick terms, and both are above the midpoint of 5, so more contradictory than not contradictory. So far, though, this effect has only been recorded for thick terms, and it is still unclear how robust the effect really is. This is why in this study, we wanted to test how pervasive the polarity effect is. And for this, we wanted to look at 2 things. First, we wanted to investigate whether the polarity effect is limited to single person attributions, as in Amy is rude, or whether it also occurs in different embeddings, such as existential quantifications or generic generalizations. Secondly, we want to test whether the polarity effect also applies to thin concepts as well, and is not just restricted to thick concepts. For this, we designed 2 studies that I will discuss in the following. So first up is the embedding studies. In the first study, we compared 3 different embeddings. First, the traditional individual attribution, as in Amy is rude. Secondly, limited scope statements such as some people are rude. And thirdly, generic statements like people are rude. And then we canceled the evaluation for each one of those embedded sentences. Now, our hypothesis was that the more general and evaluative statement, the smaller the commitment to the evaluation. Thus, it should be more acceptable to cancel evaluations the broader the embedding is. So the hypothesis we had is that the polarity effect is significantly reduced in limited scope and generics embeddings compared to individual statements. To test this, we presented participants recruited via Prolific with the following vignette. So the vignette read, please imagine Sally said the following sentence: people are rude, but by that I'm not saying something negative about them. And then we asked participants whether Sally contradicts herself or not. And again, we had a 9-point Likert scale, 1 being not contradictory at all, and 9 being highly contradictory. Just to make sure that participants understood what a contradiction is, we also had a training round where we tested whether they understand what it is and cleared it up a little bit. We looked at several different thick concepts. On the positive side, we looked at the terms compassionate, courageous, friendly, generous, honest, and virtuous. And on the negative side, we had a look at the concepts cowardly, cruel, manipulative, rude, selfish, and vicious. We ran a pre-registered studies with 872 participants, which each received 1 vignette. So it was a between subjects design, and the average age was 38, with a fixed 56% majority of male participants. So first of all, we checked whether we could replicate the polarity effect across all embeddings. So if we pool the data, whether we find the effect or not, and we found the effect there. And we also found that the effect appears in all 3 embeddings individually, as is depicted in the graph here. So this goes essentially against our hypothesis. We would have expected that the effect is strongest in individual attributions and significantly smaller in limited scope and generic embeddings. But in fact, the difference in estimated marginal means was smallest for individual statements rather than the largest. This means that the polarity effect is not limited to individual attributions, but occurs more generally across different settings. Now, the second studies was about thin concepts. And there, the overarching hypothesis was that the polarity effect also affects thin concepts and not just thick concepts. And to test this, we formulated multiple hypotheses, of which I will only discuss 2 here. So the first one is that we expected that there is no significant 2-way interaction of concept class, so thick and thin concepts, and polarity, so positive and negative statements. And secondly, we expected that the polarity effect would occur for thin terms as well, and not just thick terms. So we just expected that the contradiction ratings for negative thin terms is significantly higher than for positive thin terms. We presented the participants with the same style of vignette that we used in the previous study, only that this time we included thin concepts alongside of thick concepts. So again, the participants were presented with the following. Please imagine Sally said the following sentence. What Amy did last week was good, but by that I am not saying something positive about her. Then we asked them again whether Sally contradicts herself or not, and they had to answer on the same scale again. Now, for this study, we had a different selection of thick concepts and thin concepts. So on the thin concept side, we looked at good, great, and ideal as positive thin concepts. And on the negative side, we looked at bad, awful, and terrible. For thick concepts, we investigated friendly, honest, and compassionate as positive thick concepts, and rude, manipulative, and cruel as negative thick concepts. Now, again, this study was published on Prolific, and here we had 303 participants with an average age of 36 years. And in contrast to the first study, we had a majority of female participants in this study. We again looked first at whether we can replicate the polarity effect in a pooled sample, so irrespective of the concept classes, and we were able to replicate the effect there. So in regard to the first hypothesis, we found that the two-way interaction between concept class and polarity was indeed not significant, and this is in line with our first hypothesis. And we also found that negative thin concepts have significantly higher contradiction ratings than positive thin concepts. So in other words, we find the polarity effect for thin concepts, which supports our second hypothesis as well. On a more general note, we also found that thin concepts have a higher average contradiction rate than thick concepts, as you can see on the plot on the right. But this was to be expected, as thin concepts do only evaluate and should thus sound more contradictory when the evaluation is actually cancelled. Now, just to sum everything up, so generally it was possible for us to replicate the polarity effect in both studies. And study 1 showed that the polarity effect is not limited to statements about individuals, but also occurs in existential quantification and generics, so in broader statements. And in study 2, we found that the polarity effect occurs for thin concepts as well as thick concepts. And this indicates that the effect pertains to evaluative concepts more generally and is not just limited to thick concepts. Now, in the conclusion, I want to briefly suggest two explanations that we discussed in the paper for the polarity effect. So one explanation we came up with is the so-called social norms explanations. So according to that explanation, whenever we express a negative evaluation, this comes at a considerable social cost. In other words, blaming a person harms their social status and their reputation. And this harm is already done simply by using the negative term. And thus people are less willing to accept the cancellation of a negative evaluation. And this is not the case or less the case with positive terms, on the other hand. So praising a person comes without or at very little social cost, which means that a cancellation is more acceptable. Then the second explanation we have is the deflated use explanation. So our data suggests that positive terms have two uses because we get a kind of a bimodal distribution in cancelability ratings. So first, there seems to be a proper evaluative way in which speakers intend to praise an agent. And second, there is an evaluatively deflated manner to refer to actions that only meet our expectations. For instance, the statement, Amy is friendly, might simply convey that she meets everyday expectations, but it does not mean that we necessarily praise her for doing so. It's simply what we expect as part of a certain standard of minimal decency. Negative terms, on the other hand, do not seem to have a neutral use. So if I utter the statement, Amy is rude, this generally indicates that Amy violated everyday expectations and that she deserves blame for that. So these two explanations, so the social norm explanation and the deflated use explanation, are compatible in a lot of respects, but also differ in some of the predictions. And we are currently investigating whether the deflated use can actually be empirically shown. So this was my talk. Thank you very much for your attention. And I also like to thank again Pascal Willemsen and Kevin Reuter for this collaboration. It was really a pleasure to work on this project. And here's my email address if you have any questions or want to have a follow-up discussion. Thank you very much.
Cool. Huge thanks to Lucien for a super interesting talk. Yeah, do come up if you have any questions. While everyone's thinking, I'll ask one. Yeah, I was just interested if there was a much sort of inter-item variation, because I can imagine there might be a lot of things that vary, particularly even looking at some of the thin terms, that, yeah, some of them seem like they might be much more cancelable than others. And if you had any thoughts on whether there might be some other dimensions that could be influencing cancelability beyond sort of polarity.
Yeah, so we found like item differences. So for example, the term manipulative and honest, both were outliers in the second study. So they had significantly lower contradiction ratings than their group items. So manipulative was significantly lower than other negative items, and honest was significantly lower than positive items. And we were talking and discussing what could be a reason for this. And I think there are just terms that carry less of a negative connotation or have less of a blame or praise attributed to them. It might be that there are, like, within these concept classes, there is a variation, so that this may be like a praise blame continuum, so that their manipulative is less, does to a lesser extent express blame than, for example, cruel or brutal or something like this. And honest, for example, is less praising a person than, for example, saying that the person is courageous, or something like this. And we would expect probably the same with less positive words like friendly, for example, that are very, very neutral and also have a higher frequency to be encountered in natural language.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
So I was trying to decide to the extent to which you've addressed this, but I was still unclear on your thinking, how much you think this is about semantics per se, and how much it's, for lack of a better term, world knowledge, right? So it was very easy for me to generate situations in which I might say somebody is honest, and that's not a thing that I'm praising them for. Mm-hmm. There's definitely such a thing as being too honest. It was very hard for me to think of something like a situation in which somebody was rude, and that's like not bad, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, is this it was unclear to me to what degree you think this is a linguistic phenomenon at all.
That's a very good question. So one reason why you could think that it is a linguistic phenomenon is that we look at minimal context here. So we don't present participants with like a broader story and the setting in which the word occurs. So what we aim to look at might be something like lexical content. So in that way, we could actually argue maybe that it is a linguistic effect, but of course, like contextually, these words can vary a lot, right? And there are also like thick concepts that can change their polarity altogether. For example, if I say, "Oh, you are liberal," if I'm conservative, it's probably more of a negative evaluation. If I'm a liberal myself, it's probably more of a positive evaluation, and stuff like this. So context can invert polarity, it can shift polarities, and yeah, it would be very interesting to check whether the contradiction ratings change if we introduce more context. And I mean, you had the intuition that for negative terms, it's harder to find a way, for example, in which root is not meant negatively, but it is easy to find a way in which honest, for example, is used positively, less positively than one would expect, for example, when somebody's too honest. So it would be interesting to see whether we find these effects as well in context. That's a very good question.
Cool. Thanks very much again to Lucien for a brilliant talk.